Welcome, everybody. I'm Scott Hill from FlightClubICT.com, and we're here for another YouTube bourbon review. I'm pretty excited about this one, but I don't have any bottle here with me, so I'm going to have to turn it over to my co-host here, Stephen, to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today.
Hey, Stephen here. It's been a while since we did one of these. This time around, we're doing something that's got some roots in the Midwest, even Kansas. Comes in a beautiful bottle, has quite a story behind it. It is the Remus Repeal Reserve Series 1, their initial release. It's a bourbon with an interesting namesake and a lot going on inside the bottle. Should be fun pour to review.
Now, this came out in 2018. The Series 1 came out in 2018, and we've had a 2019 Series 2 release. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, Series 1 was released in technically November 2017. It probably didn't make its way here locally until the start of the year 2018. Wouldn't have surprised me anyway. But that 2017 date is important to remember because when you're looking here, and I'll hold it up so you can see on the label, while it's a no-age statement bourbon, there are ages associated with the blend that was included for this release. So this contains bourbon that was distilled in 2005 and in 2006. So that 2017 release date gives you an idea of the age that we're dealing with.
So we're looking at roughly 12-year, 11-year average juice inside the bottle.
Yeah, I think comfortably saying you could 10 plus years is what we're dealing with.
And I think when Series 2 came out, it had a little bit younger average age, but the proof was a little bit higher. I think it was 100 proof. What's the proof on this one?
Correct. So the Series 2 came out, I think it was early in 2019 or end of 2018. Either way, the proof on Series 1 is 94. The proof on Series 2 is 100. And that, I think, foreshadowed a little bit a release that's coming out. I think it should be this fall under the Remus name. It's called the Remus Volstead Reserve, paying homage to the Volstead Act. That's the Prohibition Act. It's the 100-year anniversary. And so that bottle is bottled at 100 proof. Increases the age up to about 14 years is what the press releases have been saying. It's going to carry a little heftier price tag, be a little bit more difficult to find. But man, the bottle on that one, got to look it up to see it. It'll be a very attractive bottle.
And we've written a little bit about Remus before and his story. Are you there?
I'm here.
All right. I wasn't getting any video of me, so maybe I'm cutting out here a little bit. So we've written a little bit about Remus before, and we've done a review once before on another bottle. So we'll talk a little bit more on our blog about the sort of the background of Remus, but talk a little bit about Remus and MGP and this being an actual MGP product from straight from the MGP brand.
Yeah. So the longer story we've actually written about on a post where we reviewed this bottle. So this is also under the Remus brand. It's a non-age stated bourbon bottled at 93.8 proof. Remus, the namesake, interesting guy. He was a pharmacist. He was a lawyer. He was a distiller. He was a bootlegger. He inspired many of the storylines that went into Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. He ran an operation out of Cincinnati. He was a murderer. He was someone that went to trial for murder but was not convicted. Just a crazy story. Interesting guy to portray with these releases. But obviously he was very instrumental in the whole the Prohibition era with the bootlegging. MGP actually started releasing their own brands not too long ago, and this is one of the brand names that they're releasing their products for. Many people have tried MGP even if they don't know it, because MGP is often used as a source for other brands for their own bourbon releases. So MGP has a distillery in Indiana, has a corporate headquarters in Kansas, distills an awful lot of good rye, good bourbon, and it's cool to see these labels that are owned by the distiller that are being released. And so far, they've really been met well with people that have tried them.
Well, interesting you say that people have had MGP and they may not even know it. We all know that there's a lot of MGP bourbon out there on the market, and for MGP to try to differentiate themselves from all the other sourced bourbons that they're helping supply, they tend to do something a little bit different under their own brand name, and I think this is a good example of it. And that brings us back to the story earlier that you're sharing about the blend of this one, the 11-year, the 12-year, the different recipes. Get in and talk a little bit about what those different recipes are, those different ages that are included in this bottle that kind of help set this one apart.
Yeah, so MGP doesn't utilize just one mash bill for its bourbon or for its rye, for that matter. But we're talking about bourbon today, and specifically with this bottle for Series 1 of the Repeal Reserve, they utilized two different mash bills on this one. One is a very high rye mash bill. It's a 36% rye in the mash. You're probably looking at 5, maybe at the most 10% malted barley in there, the rest being corn. That's a very high rye bourbon. You're really only going to find maybe one other popular brand that uses that high of rye in their bourbon. That'd be Four Roses. Next, the other parts of the blend are also a relatively high rye mash. Is 21% rye in those. So when you're mixing a lot of rye in with these bourbon blends and putting some age in there, with these being 10 plus years old in this medley, you're going to get a lot of mature rye spice that's going to come out as very herbal, very fruity. It gives a lot of interesting flavor against the backdrop of a traditional bourbon profile of your vanilla, your caramel, your dark chocolate, that sort of thing. So all intermingled together. What MGP did with this Repeal Reserve was selected certain barrels, married them together, found the right marriage that they thought worked for this. They diluted it down to 94 proof, and we're going to jump in here in a minute, but you really can't argue with the result. They did a pretty darn good job.
Yeah, and I've had this. It's been quite a while ago since I got to try this one, but I'm excited to try it. I've been nosing it here a little bit, and you're right. There are a lot of those higher rye smells on the nose, but let's go ahead and get into the nose, unless you have anything else you want to talk about before we get into notes here.
Now, as you're nosing, I'll just say once more that the basic specs of this bottle are: it's a blend of 3 different bourbons. One that was distilled in 2005. That's the 21% rye mash. That comprises 50% of this blend. So next, there's a bourbon distilled in 2006, and that one has the really high rye, 36% rye. That's 15% of the blend. Then the remaining 35% comes from another 2006 distilled bourbon, again with that little bit lower rye content of 21%.
And the first note that I'm picking up is kind of a buttered popcorn, but there are definitely some baking spices that hit right along with that. That butteriness really hits me pretty hard, but there's some nutmeg, some cinnamon, and some brown sugar for sure in there. A somewhat traditional bourbon nose, but with certainly the kind of amped up corn flavor for me, and the amped up baking spices.
What it kind of reminds me of a little bit is those specialty popcorn blends that you can get, where you've got like the caramel popcorn mixed in with like the kettle corn style, like kind of sweet coated popcorn too, because there's just that little bit of toasted quality there. So when you get one of those specialty popcorn blends and you got a lot of different smells going on, this kind of resembles that to me.
You say that, and what came to my mind, a visual, is the popcorn that has that like bright red tint to it that I think is a cinnamon like flavor on there. That you know, once you see that, once you smell that, you know exactly what it is.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes from the high rye content here, um, and then a, a good mature aging with 10+ years, you're going to get a lot of those different barrel flavors too, a lot of those different oak smells, and then I anticipate too we'll get it in the palate as well.
This doesn't jump out of the glass, and I'm fairly certain that has something to do with it proof down to 94 proof, which is, at least in our world, fairly low for a bourbon. But I think it helps mute some of um, those little bit stronger rye spices, and this really comes across as pretty buttery or pretty creamy.
Yeah, this is one that it does not need to be poured over ice. I don't think you really want to add much, if any, water to this. It seems like they were going for more of a refined experience throughout. With it is a little bit softer nose, but you can really get in there and try to pick out different things. It doesn't just overwhelm you right away when you're initially nosing the glass.
There's some fruitiness in there, maybe a little bit of kind of muted citrus, maybe a little blood orange, a little bit of apple, maybe a little bit of pear. Pretty soft fruit notes though.
Yeah, I think that the fruit takes a little bit of a backseat to some of that spice that you were talking about earlier. So for some of the other MGP bourbons that I think people might more readily attribute to, with having experience maybe with Smooth Ambler, um, or some others, I feel like this is trying to go for something a little bit different for MGP's typical profile. It doesn't have some of that really dusty cedar type of scent you would get from maybe a Smooth Ambler, Old Scout.
No, and it doesn't have, I've just had some of those kind of odd MGP low floor rickhouse blends that are just kind of these funky fruit bombs. It doesn't really have that funkiness to it. It's still much more cinnamon baking spice forward than a lot of those. To me, it's got a little bit of kind of a soft Four Roses kind of OESK kind of note to the nose. Just sort of those baking spices. Not a like a really good private select OESK, but just kind of a run of the mill OESK. Good nose.
Oh yeah, solid nose. The oak really shows up on the palate initially on this one. It's interesting to think what maybe had been attempted in early production of this, pulling older barrels and finding out the oak would have overwhelmed the palate on this. This gives plenty. I don't think I'd want much more.
I get a little bit of like plywood flavor at the beginning that just ramps up to more of a crisp, sharp oak, and then once that oak sort of burns off the front of your palate, the spice really hits really hard, sort of at the back end of the palate.
Yeah, that baking spice rack shows up here. Gosh, there's a lot of spice going on. Trying to pinpoint whether there's one more prominent than the others, but if I had to think, I think it's more of the nutmeg kind of spice. So it's a little bit of that's a softer spice compared to ground cinnamon. But it's interesting how there's several different flavors there, but they are very cohesive on the palate.
I get a little of flat cola on the beginning of the palate, kind of like a almost like a diet cola, kind of an odd mouth feel as those wood notes are ramping up and those spices are starting to come through. I get sort of that muted flat cola taste. Do you pick up any of that?
Yeah, and definitely much more of like it's more Coke than Pepsi because it's not as sweet. I don't think as I don't get a lot of those kind of sugary notes there on the palate either.
I'm thinking like a diet right. I mean, I'm going old school here.
There you go. There is some milk chocolatey candy coating here too. Like the maybe the coating of like the brown M&Ms.
There's certainly a corn note, but it's different than the popcorn note that we were picking up on the nose. This is more of a creamed corn flavor at the beginning of the palate that starts to fade a little bit mid palate.
Some of those fruit notes that were underneath the initial layers on the nose, some of the citrus, I'm not really finding on the palate on this one. They're not really emerging anywhere for me. Maybe we'll see once we focus on the finish if they come back. This is more of the oak, some soft sweet notes with like the flat cola or the brown M&Ms, and then it's the baking spices.
The only fruit citrus that I'm really picking up on is I get a little orange oil as those baking spices are picking up about mid palate. They're kind of in the background, but it's that oily orange. If you were to squeeze an orange rind, you get that oil. That's what I'm kind of picking up there on the back end of the palate.
Right. Yeah. If you were to, maybe you're going to rim a cocktail glass or something, I can see that.
I'm a little disappointed in the beginning of the palate, but it really ramps up there at the end, more to what I would call the finish. There's a little bit of bitterness, a little bit of a bitter oak on the finish, but I get a lot more flavor on the back end of the palate finish than I do at the start of the palate.
It does seem to take a little bit of time to develop. It's interesting. The majority of this blend is from that older bourbon, that 2005 batch, and so I wonder where in the warehouse they grabbed those barrels from. But gosh, they got plenty of age on them. I mean, you've tried stuff that's 20 plus years that I don't know how much stronger the oak can really get before that's all that you can find.
Well, any Four Roses that I was picking up on the nose, I feel is completely gone here on the palate. I think it takes a little bit of a different direction, and I really think that the palate and the finish start taking a little bit of different directions as they go through as well. It doesn't have a consistent feel, a consistent flavor throughout, but it's a nice ride. They're not contrasting flavors that don't work well together. They're just not the same flavors throughout.
Yeah. And I'm not saying this in the way that it has some of that really old, dusty bourbon character for stuff that was distilled, in the 80s or earlier. But in the sense that there's so much oak here, I think if you tried this blind, you would guess an age much older than this is.
Yeah, drawing on the finish, licking an old oak board. I don't think this really, in my mind, doesn't really get into that tannic oak, although there is some bitterness to it, but it's more of a cocoa than a kind of a bitter tannin kind of flavors. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I would not describe this bitterness in the same way you would like a red wine that gets really tannic. This is a different sort of bitterness. Yeah, with the cocoa, with like a really dark chocolate. You might get it from there. It doesn't have the kind of bright character that was in shades on the nose. And that finish, it is really, I mean, the grape skin, the cocoa, that's the last chapter of this bourbon.
If I were to give you a playing card that had a nose, a palate, and finish, different cards, would you match those up and suit? It really doesn't seem like this nose connects to this finish in any way other than through this palette. There's just no similarities, but I do feel like the palette helps with that transition to get from one to the other. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, when you think about the way your mind starts to go when you nose a glass and you think, okay, this is what I can expect. This is what I'm in for here. Not all surprises are bad, and this does surprise me a little bit with what you end up getting. And I don't know that if I had to nose a few glasses and then come back to them, if they got switched around, if I'd be able to tell that this is what I had sniffed it earlier. And so, yeah, that is, they don't all line up exactly.
But I do feel that the palette helps with that transition. I mean, if it had a palette that matched either the nose or the finish, it wouldn't work at all. But that palette really helps transition one to the other. It works for me. This works for me.
Oh, yeah. And now that maybe it's a little bit of extra air, or just spending a little bit more time with it, what I like, too, about the finish here now is it kind of develops into a little bit of tobacco, which I always think is a great quality in a finish. Not real smoky, but it's more like I don't know. It's kind of like a pipe tobacco.
I was going to absolutely say it's a pipe tobacco. It's not a cigar. It's not a cigarette tobacco. It is a old man, which I feel like I am, an old man pipe tobacco. What do you think about let's give this thing some scores? I think we've pretty much covered the notes on it. Let's maybe score this thing.
Yeah, it's interesting to try to score this too, from what we were saying earlier with the difference with the nose and then coming to the palate and finish. But starting with the nose, there's a lot there that was interesting. There wasn't anything really off-putting that I picked out. I liked all the spice. And so I think on the nose on this, I'm not quite sure it gets up to the 4 out of 5 category for me. So I think I'm ending up settling on a 3.5.
I think that's where I'm at as well. I always start at 3 and kind of decide whether 3 is satisfied, whether I feel that I tilt one way or the other. I certainly don't tilt towards the unsatisfied or dissatisfied. And I do feel like I tip a little bit more towards I'm a little bit more than satisfied with it, but it doesn't go much beyond that. It's a good nose, but it's not great. But it's something I'm happy with, and I definitely come back to.
And you know what I think too is that for someone that's earlier on in their bourbon journey, that wants to go out and kind of splurge a little bit on a bottle, hasn't ventured too much into like the high proof stuff, this nose is going to rank even higher for them because it's so approachable and you can pick up on different things. And there's, with all that rye in there, there's some interesting qualities to it that you don't get out of just your run of the mill bourbon. So for other people, I'll acknowledge, I think this could be a little bit higher than a 3.5.
Where are you at on the palate?
It's interesting because the initial palate to me is not my jam, like that really oak forward beginning part of the palate for me doesn't have that intrigue, but I like the way that then it develops and kind of takes a couple of turns later. So that drives it up for me a little bit. I think it might be a 4 on the palate. I mean, I just like how this drinks. I think I'm interested in how it develops there. You can really spend some time on the palate on this one. So it might be just that interest factor there that puts it up to a 4 for me on the palate.
In my mind, I'm starting again at that 3, and the flavors themselves stick right around that 3 for me. Nothing that I think is like you said, totally my jam, that really wants me to go higher. But what in my mind I'm coming down to is the complexity of this palette. I think it's a little bit of what you're describing too, which really does kick this up for me. I think I'm falling more about the 3.5, but that complexity, that ride that this palette takes you on, I think is really unique. It's different than anything that I have in my cabinet for a palette. I'm pretty intrigued by it, and I'd give it a 3.5.
And then on the finish, I would have probably ended up settling on a 3 until that tobacco developed, which I think maybe just a result of giving it a little bit of time. And so once that tobacco developed, that pushes it up to a 3.5 for me. I really like it when that is the finishing touch on a bourbon, and you really don't get it unless you spend just the right amount of time in the barrel. I mean, there's just no other way to replicate it. So I think I land on a 3.5 on the finish.
I'm right there with you, and for the exact same reasons that that pipe tobacco really carries this thing forward. I'd be really interested to see this blend at something a little bit higher proof and see what happens with that pipe tobacco, see if it becomes a little bit overwhelming or steers more towards that tannic side as we were describing earlier. But right now, it's a really good amount of pipe tobacco. It probably would get a little bit higher to the 4.5 for me if that pipe tobacco carried on a little bit forward, a little bit longer, and maybe had a couple other flavors along with it, some fruitiness, maybe some cherry or something like that to complement it. But just that pipe tobacco alone probably carries this thing to a 3.5 for me.
So this on, let's talk about a value for a minute, and then we'll eventually get to kind of an overall, even though our overall doesn't take value into account. So this is Series 1 for a new branch that is coming out of the MGP world, new brand that's branching off. And so this retails at $75. And so in some ways you can see why that is. It's, you know, the bottle is trying to really catch your attention. It looks like it's supposed to belong on the top shelf. It's got the age factor there being 10 plus years. The 94 proof though does not, I think, quite match up with that price point. And so that could give you some pause. But from what I understand, that Series 2 being 100 proof and just a little bit younger, it's also $75. Later on, that Volstead Reserve that's coming out, that's going to be 14 years old, 100 proof, bottled in bond. It's going to retail for $200. It'll be a little bit harder to find. So that's just some broader context. But looking at this, $75, I don't know. I like it, but I'm not sure that quite meets that $75 price point for me.
For me, I think if I had paid $75 for this bottle, I think I would feel satisfied with that. I feel like this is a 3. Now, that doesn't suggest that I'm going to go out tomorrow, since I don't have a bottle of this, and go out and buy one. That's not a 3. A 3 doesn't mean I'm going to rush out and buy one and be satisfied with the purchase. 3 means if I have it, I bought it, I'm satisfied with that price. And I think that's where I fall. For me to go out and spend $75 on this bottle, it would probably have to be in that 3.5 to 4 range. But had I bought it, I'd be happy with it.
Yeah, so I would like to do comps on price point. You know, I think about so there's another bourbon that's out there that's 10 years old. That fetches a much higher price than this. How about the Michter's 10? The proof on the Michter's 10 would be, I'm trying to remember what it is, but it's not too far from this, is it?
Yeah, I don't. It's been a while since I've had it. I don't have a bottle, so it's not barrel proof. It's under, so I think it's under 100 proof if I remember right.
And what's that retail for?
When I've seen it's 120, 130, but impossible to get. Not impossible, but difficult to get at that price.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm just Googling it right now, and you're seeing a bottle of it can be yours right now on caskers.com for $458. And the proof is the same as this, 94. So, that would be the extreme end. But then you've got bottles like your single barrel picks of Knob Creek, another higher rye product, that are going to be 45, higher proof. And I mean, that would be on the other end of the extreme, I think, on the spectrum, because the value on that is outrageous. You get some of those that are not just 10 plus years, but 12 plus, 13 plus. So this ends up falling pretty close in the middle of that. And again, it's eye catching. And so I don't know, I think it might end up landing at about a 3, but it's getting a little bit close there on the value.
Yeah, there's a lot of competition in that price range. I think where this kind of maybe stands a little bit unique, and maybe hits more on our overall score is, this is 11, 12-year-old MGP whiskey blended together in a very nice way, a very good blend, and it's $75. From that doesn't offend me. We recently reviewed a Four Roses blend, their newest release that was a $55-$60 release. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was multiple recipes, but it was all in that 6 to 7 year range. I'm not necessarily commenting on how I feel on the overall quality of the two different blends, but from a price standpoint, 75 doesn't offend me when you've got a 6-7 year Four Roses product coming out of that $55-$60 range.
Yeah, and you're right about that with the age. They try to make up with that Four Roses Small Batch Select with a little bump up in proof, but still. Yeah, you're starting to get into some tough competition up in the $75 price point. But I think if it stays there for further releases, and especially if they maintain the quality of it, I think it'll become accepted. I'm certainly not willing to give above a 3 here, and I think some people might think this is a little bit overpriced and wanted to acknowledge that. But what do you think overall, taking price out of it then, just the product itself, your enjoyability factor overall, where do you land?
I think I gave it 3.5 pretty much across the board, so I'm going to be a little bit hard pressed to vary from the 3.5. But I do get back to a comment I made earlier of just the individual flavors as it goes through this, with sort of the inconsistency from the nose to the palate to the finish. I might drop down to a 3, but at the same time, I think I'm kind of carried back up to that 3.5 because of that complexity on how well it transitions from one flavor to another. I'm pretty happy with it overall. I think I probably tilt more towards that 3.5 than the 3.
Yeah, I'm a 3.5 here. It's not quite up to the 4. Usually for me, a 4 represents something like one of those really good Knob Creek single barrels, or maybe like Elijah Craig barrel proof. I mean, the theme being when you get those really higher proof bourbons, you just get a lot more. That's just the truth of it. There's just a lot more there, and then you can dilute it down to your preferences. Here, I don't think you should add anything to this. I think it's good at where it's at. It's more than satisfying to me, but not quite up to a 4 out of 5.
If you were to come out with a Series 2, and I take it you've not tried Series 2. I've not tried Series 2.
I've not. I've seen it. It's around Wichita, as is there are a couple bottles of Series 1 still at a few places. But yeah, I've not tried Series 2 yet. I'd like to.
If you were to take Series 1 and you were to improve it for your palate, tell me 2 things that you might do to Series 2 versus Series 1.
Well, I do what they did. I'd increase the proof a little bit. I wouldn't make it barrel strength, but increasing the proof to 100 I think was a great idea. And then also what they did, and again, I haven't tried it yet, but making the blend a little bit younger to maybe soften that oak in the profile, to me makes a lot of sense. And finally, on this one, it's the medley has 15% of that 36% rye, the rest being that 21% rye. I'd really like to see, in addition to maybe the slight decrease in age, more of the blend carrying that 36% rye mash, and seeing what that does.
I don't disagree with any of those 3 points, although the first 2 are the ones that I was hitting on. I would do exactly that. I would raise the proof a little bit, and I would lower the average age, and I might actually go out and go buy Series 2 just to see if it does what I think it could do. Because I think, in my mind, if you correct, and I don't want to say correct as in they're doing something wrong, but if you kind of correct those 2 issues, this really could carry up to that 4 for me, and I'd be really happy with this.
And one thing that's interesting too is some people will probably see it as a correction. Some people might not, frankly, if they're not a fan of the higher proof. But regardless, what's interesting now is you have a Series 1 and a Series 2 with enough differences that you can compare and contrast, which is always fun, and a lot of what we like to do, hence the name Flight. Is to have a few different things. Sometimes it's really nuanced. Sometimes it's totally different, night and day. But to be able to compare them and think, okay, well, what does that then tell me about where my preferences are? And it does make it more fun. So yeah, I agree. I think I will search out Series 2 at my next visit to the bar or looking around a store, and really give thought to giving that a try. And I'm definitely excited about the Volstead. If we can find
definitely excited about that. See what they have up their sleeve for kind of the ultra premium release. Certainly we know that they've got the quality of product, and it's just a matter of looking forward to seeing what they actually release under that name. So pretty excited about that. Anything else that you think we need to cover? I think we've covered scores. Are we pretty good on this?
I think we've covered scores. There's a little bit of anticipation for some other releases in this line. And then if people want to check out more the history of George Remus, but then also some background on MGP, go to flightclubict.com and check out our previous post of the George Remus bourbon that we did some time ago. And then we'll get this review posted up there too, with links in there to find out everything you want.
Yeah, the story of Remus is definitely an interesting one. It's an interesting selection for MGP to take on that ownership of this scoundrel. But I think that's sort of what that bootlegger era was about, and I think they're running with that brand. And I'm excited to see MGP starting to run with their own branding, and the fact that they are taking their products and blending them in a way that their customers, their corporate customers, their blenders that they sell to can't really do. I don't think MGP is selling, these various different components to a single other non-distillery producer. So I think what we're going to see coming out of MGP is a lot more stuff like this, and I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, and rumor has it there should be some store select bottles exclusively for certain retailers, similar to the single barrel pick thing. So hopefully that will develop further and we can try one of those and see what's in store. But a lot of exciting stuff happening at MGP.
All right, well, we'll sign off until next time. We'll bring you another YouTube review, but in the meantime, keep checking out flightclubict.com and find out and see all of our other reviews. So signing off. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks.